Welcome to Authentic Living with Roxanne, a place where we have conscious conversations about things that really matter in our lives. And now, here's your host, Roxanne Derhaj.
Hi, everyone. It's Roxanne Derhaj. Thanks for tuning in again this week. Today, I have an amazing woman that I spent some time with in Rome at the WIN conference, and she was on the main stage talking about female leadership. Her name is Wendelijn. Wendelijn, thanks so much for coming on today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a joy to see and hear you again.
So Wendelijn caught my attention because, as you know, I talk a lot about female leadership and diversity and inclusion in the workplace. But she's a historian and a female leadership expert based in the Netherlands. And what captivated me when she spoke was, the history about not just female leadership, but really as societies, what we're looking for in reference to the definition of happiness and what makes us as a society want all the basic things we always talk about. And that's why I thought I would love the opportunity for Wendelijn to come in and talk today with all of my amazing listeners. So Wendelijn, tell me a little bit about what got you interested in studying history?
That's a great place to start. Yeah. What actually got me into history when I was 12, and I told this when we were in Rome. I said this in my lecture as well. When I was 12, I heard the story told on TV that in our lifetimes we all inhale a molecule of everyone who has ever lived on planet Earth before. And I thought that was mesmerizing. And I thought of all the great men that had gone before. And I thought of Tutankhamun, and I thought of Martin Luther King. And I don't know exactly why at 12 years old, but these two men stood out to me. And I do understand why, certainly because I just had learned about Martin Luther King, and I was mesmerized. And over the years, history was a fascination to me. But over the years, I also started to realize that although I loved history, and it was what drove me to studying history, that very quickly into my first year, I realized there is actually almost no focus on women's issues or women's history, or actually to think of it as women's history, that it's such a strange division that we have. What we call history is almost only a male perspective. So although what drove me into studying history was sincere intrigue and interest, what drove me to the topic of female history, and I have to say in the beginning, not even only female history, but minority history in general, what drove me there was that I thought, this is just not possible. We're living in the 2000s. And we are still viewing history from a really, really male perspective. And that is because in my case, I'm an historian, but I'm also an ancient historian, and my research and my work at the University of Utrecht has always been for the chair of ancient history. I'm mainly a Roman historian, although I also have my titles in mainstream contemporary history, which is for a topic like leadership, a perfect combination, I have to say. But what really, really drove me to studying the Roman women and leadership in the Roman period was because these sources were in back then and throughout history actually made by men, written by men for a male audience mostly because of all the limitations socially and legally for women. But it has also been transmitted throughout the centuries by men, and it has been studied by men. So of course it's really logical that our perspective on the place of women in history, certainly that long ago, was really male dominated. And I just love the exhilarating perspective of sort of hopping on this new wave of researchers that was starting to emerge in the beginning of the 2000s, to study female history. And certainly in the Roman era, I thought it was amazing when I started to learn a little bit more about the roles and societal roles women could have in the Roman era 2000 years ago. I was really, really flabbergasted, I have to say. And that was when I scratched the surface, that was what drove me into studying women, and actually also led me into doing the research that I did, which was focused on the visual representation of women in the public spaces of Roman cities, which were the most honorable places to be visually present. So yeah, that's
prior to 2000s, what you're saying is that the history of Roman times did not really focus on the female leaders that were there. And into the 2000s, there was more of a focus on the female leaders and putting up their statues in significant places throughout Rome. Is that what I heard you say?
Yeah, what happens is when we look at how women's studies have been developing, women's studies, so not only the historical perspective, is that from around 1975, we see researchers emerging who are studying women, but mostly in literature. And it is not until the 2000s that within academics, we started to realize that literature is just not the place to look for these women to get a well-rounded view on them, because mostly they were not portrayed in ancient literature because of the fact that in ancient times it were mostly men who were writing, and the few women that were writing were just not copied throughout the centuries, because we still have that literature because of the monks in Christian monasteries who were copying these ancient texts. And they, of course, within Christianity, it was not seen as really honorable for women to have that sort of stage. So a lot of the women in literature were actually excluded from the sources throughout the centuries. So what has been transmitted has been really edited. On the other hand, what started to happen in the early 2000s within the historical field and research was that archaeology became much more important to study minority histories. And for example, my research focused on statues of women and inscriptions of women, the buildings that women built within their societies. And these are sources that are still there. They have not been edited like texts could be edited throughout the centuries. So
was the excavation of some of these statues, or did they always exist, but the text to substantiate who they were and what they did, that was lost in the translation into Christianity from olden times?
No, it was even more. When you look at the sources that we have from the Roman era, you have on the one hand the literary sources, so stuff that Roman authors wrote, but also, for instance, the law, those are really literary sources. We have them as books nowadays. And on the other hand, you have the archaeological sources, and the literary sources have been transmitted over the centuries via these monks in monasteries, because that they were not, we don't have the originals, because it was really the material on which was written was not sustainable enough to sort of survive all these centuries. So they were copied, all these texts. But what you can imagine is that, on the other hand, these statues and these buildings, they were just there. They were simply there. They were only not being studied by the historians until like 30 years ago or 25 years ago. So that's why we see it's a little bit more objective as a resource to study. And that's why I also, as an historian, it was a bit odd not to focus on texts because it's what we do normally, but to focus on the material sources that we have.
Amazing that had been, it's funny, right? Like you said, with how much religion has played, a space in history. Yeah. And, when you go back to archaeological sources, like, when I was in university and studied archaeology, the facts, the ruins and, the bones that were, like the reality is it's being excavated and has a voice.
Yeah.
Right. Yes. And then what does this actual these artifacts actually teach us? Now, you spoke about some amazing women. I want you to maybe, I know you probably can't talk about all of them, and but if you can kind of tell me about some of these women and what you told amazing stories about them, and what people need to know about some of these. I'm going to say they've been teachers and leaders for like you said, 2,000 years, but we haven't known about them.
No,
who would you share with us? And I know it's probably hard to pick a favorite.
Oh yeah. Well, I have to say, you sort of make it easy on me, because there are for me two favorites. Because one, I published my book on the first one, and the other one is also a woman who I've studied and talked about in depth. So first of all, I think it's really interesting to mention, just to illustrate what kind of impact women could have. I think it's nice to start in Pompeii, because everyone, although you might not know anything about Roman history, Pompeii is a place a lot of people have heard about. And we can say that, let's say, until 30 years ago, we thought women had no place in society from sort of a powerful leadership perspective. And in Pompeii, there is a woman called Aimachia, and Aimachia was the first Roman woman I really studied in depth. And she was always referred to in the scientific literature as, yes, she was a really important woman in Pompeii, and she built the biggest building on the Forum. That was it, nothing else, which was sort of intriguing, because why stop there? But for some reason, that's exactly an illustration also of what has happened in academia. So I took up this case of Aimachia, and what turned out is that Aimachia was a woman in Pompeii who lived around, she was probably born around 40 BC, so about 2,000 years ago. And within the Pompeian society was about 20,000 people large. And you had the city senate, and they were ruling the city. And there were some people in every sort of generation who were sort of the main the main characters who determined sort of the course of the societal dealings with Rome, but also how prosperous Pompeii was. And that was something that was not just only how Pompeii, how it went for Pompeii, but how Roman cities outside of Rome were managed. It was really important to have sort of a couple of characters in town who were like the super mayors of their town. And one of these people around 40 BC up till, let's say, 10 AD was this woman called Ermachia. And she not only had a vast fortune, she also ran a couple of major businesses in Pompeii. Her father had died, her husband had died, and within both families, there were large businesses, an oil factory, a wool producing business. There was actually a brick factory also, and she led all these businesses. So she was a powerful businesswoman, and it wasn't the norm that women could run these businesses. But because of the situation that her dad and her husband both had died, it was just, there was no one else to take up that leading position. And it was possible for women to take up that position. And she did that. So she had her own money, and a lot of it. She ran her businesses. Within these businesses, there were a lot of families who were dependent on her and on those businesses. So she had an extensive network and clientele system that she was heading. So she was a big figure in Pompeii. And what happened was that that the city senate awarded her the right to build in the Forum of Pompeii. And of course, the Forum was sort of the not only the political center of a town, but also the social and legal and religious center of a town. And there she built not just a building, but she built the biggest building on the whole Forum, and she made it a public building. So it was not exclusively for her and her network. It was a public building, and it was a large public garden with the most beautiful ambulatory walks around it, with art and beautiful gardens to look at. And in it was a statue of herself donated to her by association in Pompeii of the wool producing manufacturers who were honoring her for her role in Pompeii. So when you entered Pompeii from sea, you entered the Forum, and the first thing that you would see was not the most important temple on the Forum, for instance, the temple for Jupiter, or the political buildings. No, the first thing that you saw was an incredibly big inscription naming Ermachia and seeing her building. And when the doors were open during the day, you would see straight ahead her statue and her portrait statue in that space. So she was, in the most literal sense, center stage in Pompeii, in a society that actually limited women legally and socially. But you see right away what kind of dichotomy we have between ideal versus practice. The law is sort of the ideal that's there in a society, but it doesn't say a thing about the practice and about what a society needs. And Ermachia is really a beautiful example of that. Pompeii.
So it's so fascinating, right? Like when you go back that long, and it, like you said, it's the explicit conditions that existed at that time, and the implicit ones. Clearly, women like Ermachia were demonstrating capacity, were able to lead, were
Yes.
able to run massive businesses, multiple, no doubt,
Yes.
and be able to, in that time, with women not having the rights, still be able to manage in
Yeah.
a at a time when women generally would not have had much of a voice,
No.
politically or legally.
Yes, absolutely. And that's the thing, because oftentimes as researchers, we stop there. And I know you are a psychologist. When you take a moment to realize what it would have meant psychologically as a human being who is limited, and she knows she's limited legally and socially. But for her to build that building in the forum, she was needed on site as well for inspections. She was needed to um, to manage all the dealings with the Senate, who had granted her the privilege of being able to build in the center. For that, you need to communicate with the highest political organ there is. So when we say women had no power, you can ask yourself, what is power? And I think the most literal definition is that you have influence on what is happening around you. And she might not have had political power in the sense that she was able to fulfill a political position. But I don't think it really limited her, because she did everything that a senator could have done. And that's the really interesting thing I think we can take away from that. It was not nothing, and it was not oftentimes it is said, yeah, women like Amakia could be like that because they were really rich and because they inherited the sort of male lineage fortunes within the family. But the same goes for the men who inherited the fortunes that were in their families. And on the other hand, it takes a real character to have, excuse my French, but to have the balls to deal with a city senate and to do something just a little bit different than people were used to. And she did that. And although we don't have any literary sources on her to sort of pinpoint her character, I do think we get a glimpse of her in the sense that there was another woman in Pompeii who built a temple right next to her. And that's amazing as well. That must have been a really important woman as well. But to build a temple is a little bit more safe. It is, yeah, sort of falling into the norm of what you did as a Roman benefactor. And that woman was called Mamia. A lot of these civic benefactors were honored by the city senate with a public funeral and a public tomb. And there was one specific burial street where you find these tombs of all these men and women who were awarded these honorary tombs and honorary they were called funus publicum in Latin, so a public funeral. And Hymakia wasn't buried there, but she was buried in another burial street. And there she built with her own fortune, and she states that really clearly in an inscription, she built there again the biggest tomb imaginable, outshining all the tombs that were in 8 burial streets in Pompeii. She built the most lavish, extravagant, gigantic tomb possible, with on the third tier, it was about 10 meters tall. On the third tier, she was in a seated statue on top of it. So again, she was like saying, here I am. This is my family name, because she was, of course, representing her family. This is who I am, and don't you dare forget me, because that was quite impossible.
Clearly, she was speaking through the times to let people know the presence and the strength, and I'm going to say the voice that she could put forward, even though there were other, like you said, limitations in that time. She did amazing things. Now with these times and what you've been studying, and this is what I'm fascinated about, especially when we talk about here in North America, we talk a lot about parity and, transformational leadership and stuff like that. We're obviously clearly showing that this has existed for centuries.
Yes.
That this has been, but through different political and religious ramifications. And like you said, literature got passed down based on the powers that were be. And then there's so many things that we're learning now since the 2000s. When you think about female leadership and think about what we're trying to achieve today, what kind of things would you say as a historian and someone that works with female leadership that companies or leaders of today really need to think about when they're thinking about women in leadership?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think for me, one of the most important things to start with is, again, to emphasize that these issues aren't new to think about. We have a legacy of actually thought leaders thinking about issues like this. So we don't need to invent the wheel all over again. And although we want to adapt solutions to the times of the here and now and our current issues, but it is really comforting to know that our current issues aren't really unique in the sense of sustainable leadership and issues with ethnicity and diversity and stuff like that. It's been a topic of discussion and thought for thousands of years. And I think it supports us, and it creates a starting point in which we can sort of relax a little bit. We don't need to think this is a whole new thing. No, it's in our DNA to want to try to cooperate and lead from a bigger perspective. And the thing that the second step that I often take is to make people and businesses aware that what we call thought leaders today were what philosophers were 2000 years ago. Philosophy wasn't sort of an elite individual exercise you did in your own study like we think of philosophers nowadays. It's sort of a solitary, really intellectual endeavor. Now, philosophy was the sharing of wisdom with one another in thinking about themes as success and happiness. And for example, the Stoics, who I've been studying also for 25 years, were really adamant that to be successful as a society or individually, you needed to be in a happy place. And happiness was the sharing of what was good for the bigger good. So not on an individual level. They thought happiness couldn't exist if it existed only for the individual. So that's also really, really important to realize as sort of a second step. It is that to think about and have a broader perspective on leadership and what is success, what is happiness. I think that's all related. It's really important to know that has been thought about also for 2000 years ago. And I think it's really interesting. I have here one of my favorite Stoics, who I've been rereading again since Rome. And I think is really interesting to know this is an excerpt of a text from 2000 years ago. And it was a Stoic philosopher, Musonius Rufus. And he said about women, and then I go into what your question more in detail about the female issue, but I think this is really apt to start with. He says, someone might say that courage is an appropriate characteristic for men only, but this is not so. It is also necessary for women to be courageous and free from cowardice, so that she is overcome neither by pain nor by fear. And Stoics thought that pain and fear were the one things or the two things that kept you from really fulfilling your purpose and being happy and therefore successful. And they say, so if women lack courage, it is from lack of practice rather than from courage not being an innate quality. And I think that's 2,000 years old. That really is the bottom line for me in female leadership nowadays.
That's the bullseye, right? Like really technically, because it's for a lack of practice. It's not if you keep women or have kept women through the ages in those spaces based on the political or cultural context of that time, they haven't had the opportunities to be able to practice. And clearly what we're seeing today, that women have amazing transformational qualities that benefits so many things within companies. Yes.
And I think for women, we need two things to underpin this, what Musonius Rufus says, to make this a reality. We need to practice our courage as women, but we need men and women around us to give us the space to practice that courage. And we are responsible whether we take that space that is given to us. Like Amakia, there was just a little bit of space for her, but she ran with it, and she took it and she ran with it. And so it's up to us how to how we make use of the space that is given to us, but realize that courage is not something we have in spades without any practice. We need to practice that courage to bring to the table our type of leadership. Because I think, and I wrote about this as well last week, I think for women, a lot of the times, leadership is not so much leadership over, but leadership with. And that doesn't mean we enter sort of systems without hierarchy. It doesn't mean soft leadership, but I think leadership with others is really a different definition of leadership and power than leadership over. And that coincides with the three topics that sort of arose, or sort of learnings that I use in business lectures and workshops that arose from my research. The second sort of key learning I always communicate is that these women 2,000 years ago, if we can learn anything from them, it's that they really were very daring and skilled communicators in their representation of what they were and what they did in society. They did not shun away from expressing their roles in society. So yes, they put up statues with inscriptions naming what they did and what they had achieved. And that is something that I think we as women, we are sort of socially not, it's not a social ideal for us as women to really portray our strengths and communicate our accomplishments. But on the other hand, also in this case, we don't have the practice oftentimes in how to do that aligned to our characters, because it doesn't mean you have to be, I think that we have a lot of examples of how to communicate our accomplishments and roles from men, but for a lot of women, it just doesn't feel aligned with ourselves to express it like that. So we have to find our true expression of that. But I do think we have to express and communicate our accomplishments and our roles also to inspire others to be daring and to be courageous, to bring our hearts and leadership to the table.
This was such a great interview that we decided to turn it into a 2-part series. Be sure to tune in next week for part 2, so you don't miss out on the amazing content.
Thanks for tuning in to Authentic Living with Roxanne, creating the space for positive, healthy change. Roxanne is a keynote speaker, psychotherapist, and coach. To work with Roxanne, visit roxannederhage.com/blueprint. We'll see you next time on Authentic Living with Roxanne.